killing me.
Hello everyone, and welcome to a very special episode of the Steve Patterson Projecttt. I have one guest this week, and he's an important one. Ryan McMahon is an award-winning Indigenous comedian, activist, and speaker, and I sat down to speak with him about Indigenous lives in Canada and how the attention to Indigenous lives in Canada and the systemic racism that Indigenous people here face fits within the Black Lives Matter protests, and how we can all be allies and be on the right side of history for once. Please enjoy my chat with fellow comedian Ryan McMahon.
Our Prime Minister was quoted this week saying, knowing what we know about policing in Canada and given what we know about racism and discrimination in Canada, it's a sobering moment of reflection. A sobering moment of reflection. I'll agree with one thing. Canada could afford to sober up for a moment or a week or a day or a year or maybe a decade, because alcohol sales have spiked across Canada since COVID, and it's time to sober up, Joe Canada. In the Indigenous community, these are words we're familiar with. We've heard them a lot over the past few years, haven't we? Sobering moments of reflections. Residential schools, forced sterilization of Indigenous women and girls, food experiments, electric chairs, yes, actual electric chairs, the 60s scoop, the current state of the child welfare system, all sobering moments of reflection. And if we are in a moment, it's not one we're going to bounce back from as a country immediately. We just know too much, we've seen too much, and for some people in this country, they've experienced too much. Black Lives Matter. Indigenous Lives Matter. All lives matter. Let's pause here for a minute. Imagine the words Black Lives Matter drives your life into a downward spiral. The words make you angry or irate even. They make you scream in response when you hear Black Lives Matter. Yeah, well, fucking white lives matter too. White lives matter. And I don't know where you access those words from in your mind or your soul or your psyche. I don't know where you have to travel to in order to find the words White Lives Matter immediately upon hearing the words Black Lives Matter, but I can't relate. I can't relate in any other way other than occasionally while having sex I blurt out embarrassing things. Yeah, oh, call me your big fat white bear. Or, yeah, your ass smells like chocolate chip cookies. Man, fold me up like a taco. Yeah. You see, in the moment, those words fall out of my mouth and they seem appropriate or perfect even. But the difference between me and White Lives Matter people is as soon as I say them, I regret them and I wish I could take them back. But White Lives Matter people, you do the opposite. You crash solidarity marches, make Facebook memes asserting your heartfelt and yes, racist tropes to the masses. White supremacy is a hell of a drug, and white supremacy is not just Klansmen in hoods. It's having the comfort of denying a whole group of people their humanity. White people, I get it, man. You love cops. I mean, you invented cops. But shouting about how good cops are in front of people whose loved ones have been killed by cops is a dick move, to say the least. Do you run up to a spokesperson for Mothers Against Drunk Driving with a beer bong and car keys in your hands when they talk? No, you don't. You see, when we see the deaths of black and brown bodies on social media, white supremacy responds with the quickness. We're told that these are just isolated incidents caught on cell phones, that white people die at the hands of cops all the time. And if that's true, which it is, unfortunately, why the fuck aren't you people marching on the streets? You see, this is the problem. We're marching on the streets. When Indigenous, Black, and other diverse communities become visible to the white majority, we become a problem. And if you don't believe me, look at reserve systems in Canada. What are those? Push Indigenous people off their territory, throw them in the swamp, out of sight, out of mind. It's a system designed to keep us out of the way. Look at predominantly black neighborhoods, a century of laws and legislation that force residential segregation onto a whole group of people. White people incentivized to live in suburbs. Black communities were victims of systemic, oppressive, unconstitutional, and state-sanctioned racial discrimination. This is a moment for us to look at the systems and tear them down. So for me, denying racism and white privilege puts you in the same category as flat earthers. You exist next to preachy vegans, toxic friends you ghosted in university, and religious zealots. What I'm saying is, you're not fucking welcome at my moose hunting camp. Looting stores is bad, but looting the land is fine. The irony of White Lives Matter complaining about stealing when we can't even talk about broken treaties and stolen land in Canada is, how do you say, fucked up. Black Lives Matter. Peace.
Ryan McMahon, how are you, my friend?
I'm doing well, Steve. How are you?
I'm all right. I mean, it's a relative question these days for everyone, obviously. No, I don't think anyone's doing good. I don't
No,
think
no,
it's happening much.
I'm not doing great. I just don't want to. I just don't want to cry during this interview. So
Yeah.
just smile and make my way through it.
I will I will try not to bring up anything, although it's these are particularly challenging times, infuriating times, and I'd like to try to find some of the light in it if we can, but let's go over this. You've been a performer, comedian, just like myself for over 20 years now. Also an actor. You've gone and started your own networks. You have a great podcast, Red Man Laughing, the Indian and Cowboy Network, and you hustle. That's what all Canadian comedians do. You hustle, you got to get the work, and you do it. But you have this extra, I don't know what to call it, uh, pressure upon pressure upon yourself that you're representative of the Indigenous community and you're not shy about it. And the reason that I'm happy to be talking with you about this is because there was a dumb article amongst many that have come up saying there's no such thing as systemic racism in Canada, written by a very old white man. And you didn't flower anything about it. You called it bullshit because it is bullshit. And I know that you get flack sometimes for the way that you speak, but you need to be addressing things this way. So let me just ask you, I guess we'll start with that. The article in question was from the ridiculous National Post. But it's one of many. What would you say to someone that says there's no such thing as systemic racism in Canada?
Well, I mean, I probably wouldn't have a very long conversation with them because anybody that is willing to openly deny, never mind through a well circulated newspaper, one of the most circulated paper chains in Canada. Anyone willing to sort of deny racism exists systemically or otherwise isn't really ripe for the conversation. And so I've tried over the years. I'm embarrassed that, I've spent time in comment sections of newspapers and media websites arguing with racists. I used to spend a lot of time in those spaces. I mean, we were talking 10 years ago, but I've switched and I've just turned my attention to try to work towards bringing voice to the lived realities of Indigenous people in Canada. I myself, clearly, I look white. And so I feel like part of my privilege, my own privilege, which I well understand, is that, it's important to create space and make space for those voices and those experiences. And so when anyone says there's not white privilege, I can assure you there is. I'm a status Indian that looks white, and I used to do a joke about I could be at a hotel doing a corporate gig, and there just happened to be a KKK convention happening in the same hotel, and I could get stuck in an elevator with a bunch of Nazis, and they wouldn't look twice at me. But the same can't be said for my cousins, and so I know the truth. You've traveled across this country. I've heard whispers, and I've had a lot of deep conversations with people that don't understand the issue. But today, where we are right now, I just think it's important to kind of keep your eye on the prize, understand um, where I hope this country goes, and just keep working towards that.
Now this is a particular, I don't know whether to call it I don't want to say opportunity. Opportunity sounds too optimistic, but with the incredible momentum of the Black Lives Matter movement, in the United States because of the George Floyd murder at the hands of police and other things that have been caught on video now. Mm-hmm. Now it does seem to be an opportunity for Canada to come to the forefront and address things they've been promising to address for a long time. And our own Prime Minister is pretty careful to say, Indigenous Lives Matter and mention that whenever he says Black Lives Matter. But from your perspective, how much of that is lip service that's been happening for a while, not just with this particular Justin Trudeau government, but history in many different Canadian governments?
Yeah, there's no doubt that we're in a moment, and this might be the moment where we can finally take that pause and kind of really take a good long look in the mirror, which, we've been saying we've been saying this about Canada for decades, certainly from the Indigenous perspective, whether this is, the repatriation of the Constitution in 1982, that was a chance for Canada to look in the mirror. Um, you can go to the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples back in the 90s. That was a chance for Canada to look in the mirror. Residential schools, 60 Scoop, missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls final report. These have all been chances for Canada to look in the mirror. And we waste these opportunities when we get caught up in sort of taking care of people's feelings. And I think, you mentioned that I'm pretty unapologetic about my viewpoints and the way I present them. It's just because it's not up for debate. People's humanity is not up for debate. People's experiences are not up for debate. And so, when we kind of tiptoe around the uncomfortableness of the conversation, we waste time and we ultimately lose momentum. And so this, I think, is a moment where we're in pause, involuntarily so. COVID has us locked in our houses, and we have nothing else to do but to read Desmond Cole's new book. We have nothing else to do but to listen to Black Lives Matter and podcasts. And I mean, there's such a wealth of information. There's more material than ever. Our grandparents could claim ignorance, and but we can't. There's
No.
just more information than ever.
No, they're too busy writing for the National Post.
Rex Murphy's your grandpa?
Well,
wow, breaking news.
Yeah, you never know. It's the Eastern Canadian Caucasians all got together at some point. Now, but is there a feeling of, we spoke about it a little bit, is there any sort of feeling of, I don't want to say guilt, but how do you, bring attention to the fact that the systemic racism we're talking about is against Blacks in Canada, certainly, and is also against Indigenous peoples, and it has been going on even longer, really. How can you do complementary movements without being seen as hijacking the Black Lives Matter movement?
That's a great question, and a really, really fascinating conversation that's happening right now in real time in Indian country. There's this race to the bottom that ends up happening, where, and I find it's just a morally bankrupt race to the bottom where, we're kind of caught in this oppression Olympics, where we compare our cop beatings and we compare how bad things are. And it's like, no one deserves to die at the hands of police. No one deserves to be abused by power and systems that have historically abused us. And I think that what you've pointed to, the work of building solidarity is important work. My company, Indian and Cowboy, our podcast network, we just released a statement of solidarity on our website that people can read at indianandcowboy.com. But the first thing we acknowledge is that we have our own anti-Black racism to work on in our own community. And so, we've committed some action through an action plan. We're taking this moment very seriously, but we're also looking inward before we look outward. And so, defund the police. Let's talk about how we build safer communities, how the services that BIPOC people access don't really meet the needs of the community. But at the end of the day, also for me as an Indigenous person, let's take a look at where we're at. And so I think if there's one great equalizer in this country, is this is all work. This is work that we can all do. And it's kind of calling for that, it's calling for all hands on deck.
The terrible tragedy that happened in the midst of all this, just last week with Chantel Moore in New Brunswick, police go to answer what is supposed to be a wellness check. They're saying, please go see if this person is okay. I'm afraid she could harm herself. Ends up being shot by the police. I don't know how that happens in any respect. That's just an awful use of police force. I don't even know what else to say. But is that, and we're just seeing this in the news recently now, Is that in your view in the Indigenous community? Is that a legitimate worry every time police are called for any altercation? And
Yeah.
it's not even an altercation; it's a wellness check, and they could end up being killed by the police.
Yeah, it is. And, just a couple of weeks ago, there was an article talking about, the need for diverse communities to call on the police when something is wrong. And I forget who wrote it. It was released on CBC's website. Um, and it was essentially saying like, hey, here are the steps. If you have a problem, here's what you need to do. The call for police to intervene or to help in different situations is usually the last thing on an Indigenous person's mind. There's, communities protect themselves. And so, you look at communities like the downtown east side of Vancouver, in the core of Toronto, in urban settings where there are Indigenous communities, they take care of themselves, and they're reluctant and hesitant to call on the police, for help. And so, we can look at the long history of Indigenous peoples dying at the hands of police. J.J. Harper in Winnipeg, Neil Stonechild in Saskatoon, and so many others. Calling the police is not really on the top of the agenda when there is a conflict or when there is something happening, because what happens when you call police is that police will then take it in their own hands. If they don't cause harm in the situation, they will often then take a look around the apartment and end up intervening with child welfare and different things. And so police is pretty much a direct line to conflict for Indigenous people, and that's a pretty widely understood problem.
I had heard before, and I think this was more in relation specifically just to Thunder Bay and terrible things happening in Thunder Bay, especially in the in just in the justice system in general with Indigenous incarcerations. But that there was talk of, this could be solved to a degree by allowing the Indigenous community to have their own police force and not have the RCMP or any police force have jurisdiction over an area that's an Indigenous area, an Indigenous nation.
Mm-hmm.
Where is it on that? Do you know?
So with Canada Land, I did a 5-part podcast series on the city of Thunder Bay called Thunder Bay. And the release of the podcast series came out at a time when the police in Thunder Bay were being investigated. The Crown attorneys and the justice system writ large were being investigated. And what has come out of that is a deep understanding of the divide between the police and the community there. And there's long been calls about Indigenous policing, which in turn is not usually referred to as policing, but instead peacekeeping. We have a word in my language called Ogichida, and Ogichida is like our warrior society, which are basically the peacekeepers. They're the ones that keep the peace amongst the people, not just in community, but sort of mentally and emotionally, spiritually, physically. And the Ogichida have a responsibility of keeping the peace. And so, there are many in my home territory of Treaty 3 in northwestern Ontario. There is something called the Treaty 3 Police Service. It's been around for 40 years, widely successful. These are people from the community that live in the community that have their own police force. That work alongside and in concert with the OPP, but they are the first to respond to calls inside of communities. And let's be clear: there are obviously circumstances and situations where police are needed, and where a specific type of intervention is called for. So when you talk about defunding the police or putting in Indigenous police services, there are needs for that type of intervention, but mostly, if we're talking about someone that is intoxicated or someone that can be sort of talked down from violent situations or from mental health crises or whatever, these are most of the calls in the Indigenous community. And so, the data and the numbers don't lie. The information has been out there for a long time, but funding an Indigenous police service is a controversial topic. People sort of draw the line down the middle and say you either support the OPP and you resource them, or it's nothing. And so we saw just last week again in Nunavut, an RCMP officer speeds into the frame of a camera shot and throws open the door, and the door smacks an intoxicated male walking down the road and knocks him over and nearly runs him over. And just so happens that this one was caught on film. But people responded that are from there saying, no, this happens all the time. The RCMP are very rough on the people up here. And so there's a real live conversation about what policing looks like in Indigenous communities right now.
Do you think that there will be, now there was momentum building around the Wet'suwet'en protests before this all went, and that gained national solidarity to stop the pipeline building. Mm-hmm. Do you think that there will be a movement like the one we're seeing right now across the world with Black Lives Matter in Canada? Or my worry is that the world can't take another movement like this simultaneously. So, that's the challenge as I know that you're building on, but I hope that Canadians are seeing, obviously there is racism, systemic racism, and in many cases in Canadian, it's institutional and it's against our Indigenous nations. Mm-hmm. So, I'll ask you what I asked my friend Arthur last week when I was talking about things. For people who truly want to be an ally and who don't want to be, let's put a hashtag out there, and I think I'm done now. Yeah. For people who truly want to be an ally to Canadian Indigenous people that are not themselves Canadian Indigenous people, what can we do? What can an individual do?
Yeah, so I think you've pointed to a couple of really important things. First and foremost, Wet'suwet'en doesn't happen without Standing Rock. Standing Rock doesn't happen without Idle No More. Idle No More doesn't happen without Oka. Oka doesn't happen without the Red Paper, which was a response to Chrétien and the first Trudeau's White Paper. That these resistances are all of a piece, and they're all connected. And so connecting Black Lives Matter and the movement in Canada to the ongoing resistance of Indigenous peoples, I think, is really important. And that's where we can draw our solidarity from, is we understand that this country works very well for some, but doesn't work very well for most. And the quicker we link ourselves together that way, the better. I think that, that whatever comes next, it'll be really important that people just take the time to listen and to not be touched negatively by people's lived experiences. I mean, there are so many people that have knee-jerk reactions to people's lived experiences that are so quick to refute people's experiences, that are so quick to not listen and to talk over those people's experiences, that I think that's the best thing we can do. The best thing we can do right now is to listen to people's experiences and to try to understand and empathize a little bit where they're coming from. If I joke about, if the words white people hurt your feelings, then you're not equipped to have the conversation. If by me saying white people, do this or say this or kind of hold the line here, and you're stuck on me using the words white people, and you're not even listening to the point I'm trying to make. You're not equipped for the conversation, and it's okay. Why does Joe Canada have to have an opinion about everything? Why, you're an expert on everything? So wait a minute, you fix tractors from 8 in the morning till 8 at night, then you go home and you read decolonial theory as well. You have a lot to say about the political systems and what could be. You are give this fucking guy a TV show. Like, why isn't he our prime minister? So I'm just struck by how much learning there is to do, and that's work we can all do.
Well, and it's active learning too, and I have to say, I'm just as guilty. I often asking people what I can do. It's pretty easy to figure things out and listen to things. And look, I love to get a laugh in when I can, even if it's a serious matter. So I love the way that you do things. I love the way that you highlight other Indigenous artists, but it's always entertaining. And you know what? I think that people also have to get angry to make movements happen too. I know you want peace, and I know you want to do things peacefully, but things don't happen if you keep asking politely, and that's why things have to happen, like blockades and the Black Lives Matter entire movement, and look at the things that are getting done. So I just want to say, if we're complaining about property before we complain about lives, then that's a problem. Yeah. And so when people challenge me and they go, well, they shouldn't be jumping into Target and taking TVs and stuff, I'll go onto their timeline and I'll say, I'm sorry, I'm looking through your post here and you've not said anything about the murder of George Floyd. You've not said anything about Breonna Taylor. Go through the list of all the high profile cases that people are talking about, right? There's not a single post about the murder of these people, yet your energy is going towards talking about how Target is being looted. And so really trying to find a way to be, you can be uncomfortable with this moment. You can be uncomfortable with what's happening. You can be uncomfortable with people saying, fuck the police. You can be uncomfortable with all of those things. But these are human beings that are expressing themselves in this moment. There's anger, there's politics, there's change, we're seeing the melting of these systems that just don't work. And I just want to be a comedian too. I don't think I've been funny once here in a half an hour. Buddy, you've had a couple of lines in, but I think that look, we're supposed to be a comedy show, and we kind of brought things to a bit of a halt last week, and I'm gonna do another monologue on the show this week, which probably, there are other things happening, and within these things, you gotta kick the people that deserve to be kicked. That's what comedy is about as much as anything else. So I agree with you. I want to get the laughs again, but what I like is that I like comedy that has some meat too. You know what I mean? And you have that comedy. Everything, there's something behind everything that you're saying, and that's the kind of stuff that I like. So I'm behind that. I want to say thanks very much for doing this for us.
Well, thanks for not making me do stand up on Zoom. I appreciate that.
Oh no, that's next, buddy. No. We got 5 minutes. Here's Ryan McMahon, everyone. 5 minents. Just go.
But I will say I've really enjoyed this show. I've watched all of them, and if people have not watched Arthur and your conversation last week, that for me, I've been sharing that around a lot to my friends to kind of to continue to push that conversation. So I just acknowledge you by saying thanks for making that space and giving me this space, because I think when you talk about what can you do, this is what you can do, right? You have a platform. You're a well-respected Canadian audience that cares about what you say, and so by doing this is a great start. So thank you.
Well, cheers, man. Thank you. And I do hope that at some point it just gets to, here's a bunch of funny people and let's be funny. And it doesn't have to be, here's this person from here and here's this person from here. Here's a comedy show where everyone's smart and funny. That's the day I'm looking forward to.
Man, that'd be great. Imagine that.
Thanks, Ryan.
Cheers. Thanks.